So good evening to all of you. I'm Carolyn Best, Director of Arts and Letters Live here at the Dallas Museum of Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our event featuring icons in the fields of art and architecture, Mark Lamster in conversation with Rick Brettell, and all about Phillip Johnson. Arts and Letters Live is supported by our annual season supporters, the K. Catarula Endowment for the Literary and Performing Arts, and the McGee Foundation Arts and Letters Live Endowment Fund at the Dallas Museum of Art. Additional major support is provided by the Hirsch Foundation. The Fairmont Hotel Dallas is the exclusive hotel partner for the 2018 Arts and Letters Live series. Promotional support is provided by KERA. An exclusive magazine sponsor is D Magazine. Now it's my pleasure to welcome our introducer and moderator for tonight's conversation, Dr. Richard Brettell, who currently serves as Vice Provost of the University of Texas at Dallas, as well as the Margaret McDermott Distinguished Chair of Art and Aesthetic Studies in the Interdisciplinary Program in Arts and Humanities at UTD. He's also founding director of the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History, which is housed both at UTD and here at the Dallas Museum of Art. Rick served as director of the DMA from 1988 to 1993, and prior to that was Searle Curator of European Painting at the Art Institute of Chicago. He's made a major impact on museums and the arts across the United States and around the world. For several years, he directed FRAME, the French Regional American Museum Exchange, a coalition of 12 French and 12 American regional museums, which has been hailed as a model of cultural diplomacy and exchange. He's also advised the State Department on its developing programs in the area of cultural exchange involving Africa, Asia, and the Americas. As one of the foremost authorities on Impressionism and 19th century French painting, and as a highly sought-after speaker, he's lectured in museums around the world. He's also served on the boards of directors of many cultural organizations, including the Georgia O'Keeffe Foundation, the College Art Association, and the Wendy and Emery Reeves Foundation. Dr. Brettell has contributed in so many ways to our cultural landscape here in Dallas. He founded the McKinney Avenue Contemporary and the Dallas Architecture Forum and served on their boards. And since 2015, he's served as the art critic for the Dallas Morning News. He knew American architect Phillip Johnson personally, and I look forward to the insights I know he'll bring to bear in the conversation tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rick Brettell.
Thank you so much. It's sort of odd to have such an introduction to the sidekick, but I'm here to introduce the real guy who is the author of this splendid book, and I want to be the huckster of this book because I've read it both in manuscript and in print, and it's better in print. It's so impressive and so interesting, and if you're interested in all of the ins and outs of Phillip Johnson's life, which were considerable, you'll be both entertained and enlightened, and in some cases shocked when you read it. I'm lucky to have served as the art critic for the Dallas Morning News. I'm actually resigning on the 31st of December, so you'll be the first to know, and I'm going to be a special contributor, a little bit a la Scott Cantrell, who can't seem to quit writing but is no longer the music critic. So you might need something to get me off the stage as well. One of the great pleasures of being the art critic of the Dallas Morning News is interacting with the other critics. And of course, Scott Cantrell is one of my oldest friends and is the one who suggested that I work for the paper. But the real joy of being at the Dallas Morning News is being able to work with Mark Lamster. As you all know, we had this extraordinary architecture critic years ago at the paper named David Dillon, and we were all sort of addicted to reading David Dillon, and David Dillon, as we say, passed. And then there was this interregnum, a long period of time in which we didn't have an architecture critic. And boy, did we get a great replacement for David Dillon, because Mark writes like a dream. He has a huge range of knowledge and ideas. He's interested not merely in reviewing buildings, but in the condition of urban life, particularly in a city that's defining itself as rapidly and as transformatively as Dallas is. What's fascinating is that Mark is a native New Yorker, but he loves Dallas. And that you sort of think, well, how can that be? But it is. And I actually didn't believe him at the beginning when he claimed that he loved Dallas. And I learned when the whole family moved back to Cambridge when he was Loeb Fellow at Harvard for a year and left the paper and wrote from afar. And, all of them went to Cambridge. And I was convinced that they were not going to come back. And I was totally wrong. They were all itching to come back. And so we have the science writer for the Dallas Morning News, the architecture critic for the Dallas Morning News, and their fantastic daughter, both of whom are here tonight in the audience, all coming back to Dallas because they really love living here. Now, Mark is educated not as an architect, though he's a professor at UT Arlington, in architecture and teaches architectural history and criticism, but he's very much more broadly educated. And what's interesting is when you buy this book, you will turn to also by Mark Lamster, and the list of the 3 books there which precede this book, The Man in the Glass House, don't have their subtitles. And if they had their subtitles, you would know the extraordinary range of Mark's imagination. Master of Shadows. Master of Shadows. What's that about? Well, it's about Peter Paul Rubens, and it's about Peter Paul Rubens as a diplomat as much as an artist, because he worked and took secrets and played, as it were, amongst the courts of Spain, France, Austria, the north of Italy, and England, and was this extraordinary man who we think of as, these big-boobed women moving around in huge processions, and we don't really think of him as a very subtle and able diplomat, and that's what The Master of Shadows is about. Spalding's world tour, guess what that's about? Baseball. Spalding took baseball all over the world, and Mark is a huge baseball fan and actually does a pretty good baseball announcer's routine, which if you get bored, just say baseball and he'll do it. And then the last book is the only book that actually says what it's about, architecture and film. And it's a book that Mark edited with other important intellectuals about the intersection between architecture and the filmic versions of architecture. And my prediction, Dallas loves book signings, and we're having a book signing tonight for his most recent book, but my prediction is we can have 3 more book signings where we all go to Amazon, buy the book, come to somebody's house, and he'll sign them. Because all 3 books are fascinating and they show a very wide-ranging imagination. The reason that we sort of decided to team up in this is that I actually knew Phillip Johnson pretty well throughout my life. I met him when I was a junior at Yale at a sort of lunch party at Vincent Scully's house. And in fact, one of my little secret stories about this book is you go through it and there's a chapter that says cocktails on the terrace. Well, that chapter comes from me because I told Mark about my first meeting with Phillip Johnson, in which this is in the late 60s. We're all radicals. We have long hair. We're all reading Marxist theory. We're all like we were then in the late 60s. And here was Phillip Johnson in his perfect suit and his perfect tie and his gorgeous shoes and sitting there at the end of this sort of long-haired bunch of angry young men, being there for lunch. And one of the angry young men turned to him after he pontificated and said, "Mr. Johnson, you're nothing but a cocktails on the terrace architect." And there was this incredible silence in the room, and even Vincent Scully, who was very rarely silent, was silent. And Phillip Johnson didn't bat an eye. He said, "Oh, nobody's ever said anything nicer." So I would like to introduce you to my friend and my colleague, Mark Lamster, and we're going to talk about an architect he met once and I knew fairly well. And I assure you, when I read this book, I learned a lot. And it beats knowing someone to actually research them. And that's what Mark did. And he writes like a dream. So join me in welcoming Mark Lamster.
Do we have any time left? Wow, that was nice. Thank you.
No, that was the whole idea. So
That was perfect.
Great. I have a cheat sheet, but why don't you begin rather than me?
Wait, what?
You
You're
begin.
supposed to
Come on.
ask the questions.
I know, but I mean, you said that you had something that you were going to say.
I did? Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Well, yes, I do have something I want to say. I want to say thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for supporting me. And thank especially the Dallas Museum of Art, an institution I love, for hosting me and allowing me to be a part of Arts and Letters Live. Thank you, Carolyn Bess. You know, I've said wonderful things about some of the shows here, but I've also been critical, so I know it's perhaps not easy to let a critic into your house. And in the interest of biting the hands that feeds me right now, I'll say that I was disappointed that Ben Fountain, a friend who I admire greatly, and one of Dallas's great authors, wasn't a part of this series this semester. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
always in school. His book is extraordinary, and I hope you'll support it. And I know that it hurts me that because I also have been sort of I've experienced this in an institution not interested in having me talk because my book is a little bit controversial, or not just controversial, but it's it can make people
controversial.
Well, I don't think it's controversial, but I admit that the content may make people uncomfortable in some places. So it takes a lot of guts to have to allow me to talk about it, and I really appreciate it when I'm allowed to do that. So thank you very much. And I should say also, you know, people often say that, you know, it's brave to write a book like that, but I also think should congratulate yourselves because it's really brave to read a book like that and to support critics who are saying things often that are critical and that are not always easy to hear. So as critics, that's our job, is not just to be cheerleaders, and Dallas is a place where I think it's a town of boosters. It's the history here. So it's been really fantastic to be embraced in the 6 years that we've been here, and we love it here. I love it here. But I really appreciate and don't take for granted the support I've been shown since I've gotten here. So that's what I wanted to say. I want to say thank you.
Now, the first question.
And also, please buy the book.
No, I'm supposed to say that. I'm the whore.
Okay.
You're the.
Well, John, I think that was him.
Everybody Mark spent 9 years working on this book, not 3, not 5, 9 years working on this book. And the question is, why did you take on such a huge task? And I read somewhere, I think it was in Peter Simick's article, that your editor suggested that you write this book. So why did you write this book?
That's true. My initial response when I had finished the previous book and we're sitting in a conference room wondering what the next book should be, and the suggestion was I should write a book about Phillip Johnson because it was time for a new biography to come out. No one had written a posthumous biography of Johnson yet, and him being such an important cultural figure, but my initial reaction was absolutely not. I knew the essential contours of Johnson's life. I knew about that he had been a Nazi sympathizer. I didn't know, no one knew at that point the extent to which it was bad. And I knew that there was a lot of his work that I didn't appreciate. And I didn't think that I wanted Phillip Johnson in my head for the 2 to 3 years it would take me to write a biography, not having any idea that it would take 9 years. But I went home that night and started thinking about it, and book I really, that sort of drove me to want to write about architecture and really study architecture was a book called The Power Broker. I'm sure most people here know it. A Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Robert Moses by Robert Caro. And it's nominally a biography, but it's really much, much more. It's a story about New York and its development through the 20th century. And it's also a story about power and the corruption of power. So it has this incredibly broad sweep. And I wanted to do a book that had that kind of ambition, that could have that kind of sweep. And Johnson was that kind of subject. He lived the entire American century, 1906 to 2005, 98 years. He was stirring up trouble the entire time he was alive. And it's the entire American century. And this is an opportunity to write not just about this individual, but he's a lens on which you can look at this entire period, its ups, its downs, its positives, its drawbacks, and also have at its core this man who is such a contradiction and so compelling. Once you adore him because he's charming, witty, and brilliant and handsome, but also kind of can't help but be repulsed by him because he does so many terrible things. And it's that combination that I think that makes him such a really fun person to write about and compelling person to write about, and basically irresistible. And that's how I got into this mess.
Did you, when we first got to know each other, you were in like year 5, I think, right?
Yeah, I mean, it took, the truth be told is it wouldn't have taken quite so long if in the middle of writing it I hadn't up and decamped to Dallas,
Yeah.
Which meant sort of reinventing our lives and coming from Brooklyn to Dallas, and that meant learning a whole new city from scratch and starting to write about this place. It was like kind of a crash course in Dallas and Texas that was incredibly fun, but also forced me to put Johnson a little bit on the back burner, a lot of it sometimes. That said, Dallas and Texas is a great place to write about Johnson because there's so much Phillip Johnson work here.
And I sort of, maybe it's that we didn't know each other really well at the beginning, but I had this feeling when I first met you that your book was going to be sheerly critical, that it was going to be a kind of condemnation of Johnson, and it isn't that at all. It ends up being a book that places his contradictions in a light which is at once positive and negative, and recognizes his contributions to American architecture, American museum life, all of the things that I knew without ever knowing about the things that you knew.
Well, I mean, there are tremendously positive things about him. He designed many wonderful buildings. He could be incredibly generous. He was unbelievably thoughtful. He was brilliant. He was funny. He was talented in many ways. And you want to create a book that, I really wanted the book to capture that. I think there was a previous Johnson biography, and it was very much an architectural historian's view of
Right.
Johnson. And it's a fine book, but it's kind of dry in an architectural historian's way. And Johnson didn't like the book. I think the reason he didn't like it more than any, and there were a lot of reasons not to for him, many of them unfair, but I think the main reason was he didn't really feel himself in the book. He didn't see himself, his voice, which is so distinctive, right? So I really wanted that to come through. I wanted you to see and feel him. And I wanted the book to be entertaining. No one wants to just read like a Debbie Downer, 528 pages of like, this sucks after this sucks, and that was even worse. And this, so I think
There's a wonderful scene in which there's a possible sex scene between Jane Blaffer Owen and Phillip Johnson. Wrap your minds around that.
or don't. Or don't. Yes, there's this book has everything. It's got sex, plane crashes, car crashes. It's got Nazis. It's got Israeli nuclear
parades.
reactors. It's got architecture. It's got insider trading. It's got prostitution and architecture and architecture and architecture.
And Trump.
And Donald Trump, right? I mean, that's the thing, right? I mean, we're talking about this idea of a book that has great scope, which is what attracted me to it, and the idea that, you know, the book starts in the early part of the 20th century, introducing modernism, this progressive aesthetic movement with all these ambitions of remaking the world in this very optimistic and dogmatic way, and it just sort of, the book comes to an end, and Johnson is working for Donald Trump, right? Like the most craven developer in America. Now he's, right, so yeah.
It's really a good chapter. I knew about it, but I didn't know it could be a chapter. But it's a really good chapter. The chapter on Trump.
It's my favorite chapter. It's like it's my closing gift to you.
Yeah. I'm sort of it also deals with Johnson's homosexuality, which was, you know, known by everybody throughout his life, but not really much discussed. And you actually get at various of his lovers and simultaneous lovers and long-term partners and the whole gay world. The one thing I was wondering, I was thinking of Marston Hartley and the Germans and fascism, and was wondering about gay fascism.
Well,
I'm trying to make this interesting.
well, first of all, I mean, just to be, there was something homoerotic that he claimed about fascism, right?
Yeah.
These handsome SS men in their black uniforms and boots. But I'm very resistant to justifying that. And he, in order to sort of exculpate, if that's the right word, to himself after, so Johnson was very much, essentially became an agent of the Nazi state in America, spent much time in Germany, and was a full-bore supporter of the Nazi ideology, eugenics, anti-Semitism, and I think as a way of sort of whitewashing that history, he would talk about this, he would claim like his attraction was, you know, just these sexy men, and the aesthetics, the homoerotic aesthetic of fascism, right? And I think there's a point to that, but that definitely was not what attracted to him. He was there full bore for the entire, you know, fascist, nationalist, eugenic theory, Mein Kampf. He bought in, was all about it. That said, even within the Nazi state, there was homosexuality was only at the night of the long knives, when, you know, Ernst Röhm was pretty openly gay. There was even within the SA, there was a sort of a large homosexual, you know, group until Hitler decided that that was enough and it killed them. So there was that was an aspect of Nazism for a period, but he was never a part of that at all.
No.
I mean, not at all. He was very much not a part of that. In fact, the homosexual Nazi group was a very brutish segment, I think, of that Nazi group, and Johnson was much more of the effete personage. He had been he had discovered his homosexual and came out in Berlin in the Weimar years, and
in the 20s, yeah.
In the 20s,
yeah,
right. I mean, I think
before he was an architect. I mean, he doesn't become an architect full time until
the 40s. So Johnson has several careers, right? So it takes Johnson 7 years to graduate from Harvard. because he has these emotional difficulties. Like, he's wrestling with the fact that he's gay, but he doesn't, it's a time where it's completely inappropriate to be gay, and his father doesn't approve of his homosexuality. So he has this very sad childhood, and he develops bipolar disorder, or he has bipolar disorder. So he has these periods in college when he's manic, and then when he's completely depressed, and manic and depressed, and he's repeatedly taking periods off to rest because he can't study. And I think homosexuality is a part of this. This troubles he's having. He's having trouble dealing with who he is, figuring out who he is as a person. And I think that's important with Johnson, because when we think about Johnson, the architect, we think about this person who flitted from style to style, who was an inconstant person in all things. And I think what's important to remember, to understand about him, is that that was ingrained in his personality from the very beginning. There were always multiple Johnsons. There was the up Johnson, there was the down Johnson, there was the public Johnson who could not admit homosexuality, and then there was the private Johnson who could. So there were always multiple Johnsons. So while for the average person, the idea that there could be different styles and multiple personality, multiple, not personalities, but multiple ways of seeing the world, that's untenable. But for him, it was second nature.
It's interesting, when I was reading the book, I was thinking about I have two guys, Pissarro and Gauguin, who are rather different people, and Gauguin was just as awful in many ways as Phillip Johnson. And so having to admire him and think of him as a great artist is somewhat of a struggle when one thinks of his life and his morals. But Pissarro is actually more like Phillip Johnson because he flits from movement to movement and changes style and is always interested in what the younger people are doing, and is therefore not thought to be a great artist. Great artists don't do that. Great artists have internal developments.
Right. And in architecture, which is such a moralizing profession, it's a little late in the day. It's such a moralizing profession. Changing architectural styles is not just it's just not a weakness intellectually, it's almost like a moral issue. Yeah. So when Johnson, who is this Miesian, right, he introduces sort of European modernism to the United States, and is Mies van der Rohe's principal proponent, and then becomes his partner. They work on the Seagram together, and then Johnson's work is clearly inspired by Mies. But then, because Johnson has this Oedipal urge within him, and always to be at the center of attention, he starts almost immediately to start looking to subvert Mies, to overthrow him, to cause a problem. And this is Johnson's duality. He wants to be loved, but he also wants to create a problem. He also wants to be the center of attention. He's the enfant terrible, but he also wants to be the establishment. And these two things kind of don't work together, but for him, it's those poles. He's always drawn to poles.
Well, and for him, it seems to me the institution that really sort of held him together and defined him in many people's mind was neither Harvard nor Yale, but MoMA. His association as the court architect, as a trustee, as a donor, as someone who really dominated the thinking about the Museum of Modern Art for decades.
Right, well, maybe we should describe a little bit of his relationship to MoMA. So MoMA, Johnson, as we were saying, it takes Johnson a long time to get through college, basically 7 years before he can graduate. And he's not really sure what he wants to do. He's going to study classics, he's got all these things that he wants to do. Finally, he figures out that he's interested in architecture, doesn't want to be an architect, but he wants to study architecture. And he gloms onto Alfred Barr, who's going to be the founding curator and sort of man genius, boy wonder behind the Museum of Modern Art. And he's teaching at Wellesley at the time, so they get to know each other. And Johnson sort of essentially attaches himself to MoMA through his own ambition, and is going to become the first architectural critic at the Museum of Modern, not architectural critic, my God, curator at the Museum of Modern Art. And he's able to do this because it's now in the Depression era, and he has enough money, he's independently wealthy from his family, which is its own story, but he can travel around Europe and see all this new modern architecture that most people aren't familiar with. So this allows him to sort of join MoMA as this fledgling curator, and it turns out he's a genius at being a curator. His first major exhibition is this show, Modern Architecture International Style, which Modern Architecture International Exhibition, which we now just call the International Style Show. And this is really the show that introduces European modernism, the Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, et cetera, to the United States. But it does so in a certain way, where Johnson, the European modernism had this sort of progressive political and social agenda. Johnson looks at it purely as a style, and he introduces it as a style in America. 2 years later, he has another landmark show called Machine Art, and you can actually learn about it in the fabulous exhibition on precisionism here at MoMA. In fact, the show is so incredibly influential that even today, in this show here at the Dallas Museum of Art, there is a section on that exhibition. It introduces the idea that industrial design is an art form that can be on display in a museum. Previously, if you saw industrial design or designed objects in a museum, they were usually in a period room, an Edwardian room, a French Renaissance bedroom, at the Met or wherever. But here he's taking objects of design and just everyday objects, from a ball bearing, a spring, a airplane propeller, a beaker, a waffle iron, a dentist chair, and he's suggesting that these things are art, and had not been done before, and no one had also done it in the way that he did it, on these sort of white pedestals and behind glass, a very elegant presentation. Incredibly important exhibition. And he's deemed a maestro in the New York Times, and a genius and a boy wonder, celebrating, and it's at that moment that he just throws it all away and decides not to be a curator anymore, and he is going to go off and found an alt-right nationalist populist political party, essentially a fascist political party.
In the United States, traveling all around the country. You won't be able to believe this when you read it, because it's a story that was very suppressed during Johnson's lifetime. And it's worth reading the book only for that. And then there's the sex and the other stuff on the side. But the core, this between MoMA and going to architecture school, is really scary.
Yes, there's basically more than 6 years, 7, 8 years, that he spends trying to build a life as a fascist politician, an alt-right nationalist, a populist. He tries to hook up with Huey Long, that fails. He tries to hook up with Father Coughlin, and he does, but that Coughlin, the sort of Detroit radio priest, a kind of Alex Jones meets Rush Limbaugh, if you're not familiar with him, of that period, virulently anti-Semitic, populist, anti-Roosevelt. And that falls apart. And when that falls apart, he sort of essentially just begins work continues his work trying to mainstream fascism in America. And he's spending a great deal of time in Germany, traveling through Germany, trying to learn how to establish a political party here on the basis of Hitler and Mussolini. He is meeting regularly with very high officials in the Nazi state, from the Gestapo, the SD, Abwehr, German Secret Service, German foreign diplomats. The German ambassador to the United States is someone he gets to know. And they are interested in him because he has a lot of money, and he can sort of distribute their propaganda here and pay to distribute their propaganda, and also provide them with information on people who might be interested in the fascist way. And it's interesting is that the actual Nazi state is not so interested in the American Nazi Party. They're kind of buffoonish and a PR problem. The principal interest they have is in basically keeping America out of the war. They want America to stay independent, and so in order to do this, they are interested in promoting a friendly American fascism, an American first idea, and promoting politicians and intellectuals who will parrot those ideas. And Johnson is sort of perfectly suited to that, to sort of mainstream a sort of an American fascism that maybe it strips out some of the more vulgar or brutal aspects of what's happening in Europe, but is safe enough for America that it will just mind its own business and let Germany go about what it's going to do.
And it had virtually no effect.
It had significant effect. It had significant effect. Johnson, this was not without effect. America's borders close. People, refugees can't get to America.
Yeah,
I think we forget.
that's certainly true.
You know, we talk about the greatest generation now, and I think especially the Republican Party loves to talk about this. But the truth was that the Republican Party was vehemently opposed to any kind of intervention in Europe,
Or accepting of refugees.
and massively, exactly, and completely opposed to Roosevelt and his intentions to do that. It was a very delicate balance Roosevelt had to dance at that time. It's one of the so there's a lot of, I think, parallels to our time.
So after this calamitous political phase, he goes to Harvard.
Right. Well, what happens is, Johnson bets on the wrong horse. Eventually, Pearl Harbor comes and America joins the war effort. And Johnson realizes, what a calamitous mistake he has made. And in part he's genuine, and in part it's, I think, opportunistic and cynical. With Johnson, it's always combined, right? But he needs to reinvent himself. He needs to get out of the spotlight. He needs to do something it's a disaster. So going to architecture school is his solution to this. He can, go to school, be in academia for a few years, be out of the spotlight, and maybe hopefully this will all blow over and he'll have this new career.
And it'll be associated with his success in the early 30s as a curator.
Right.
The sort of...
Yeah, I mean, he goes back to Harvard at this point, and, the irony is that, he's taking classes and they're using his own book as a textbook. So it could be, there was a little awkwardness with some of the professors at this point.
And then he builds his first house as a kind of student project off, rather near the Harvard campus, which is actually one of his most successful small buildings.
Yeah, he builds a sort of, but it was this also, so only Johnson, his thesis project is to build himself a house, right? And in Cambridge, right off Brattle Street, the most Brahmin street you could possibly have.
And right next to an H.H. Richardson house.
Right next to the Stoughton House, one of
Yeah.
the, this house that invents the shingle style, right?
Yeah.
So it's this incredibly important block. And Johnson, still feeling nervous about his public self, puts up this 9-foot tall wall completely surrounding his property. And of course, the neighbors are furious because it's like this charming neighborhood of white picket fences and colonials. And here, Johnson's answer to it is to just build up a blank wall on the street. And it's this really off-putting thing. And once you go inside the door, it's like this open courtyard, and it's beautiful and wide open, and it's this sort of Miesian glass box, very much like the glass house he would build on a smaller scale. But also, it's worth noting that this was sort of an act of lèse-majesté, right? He's at school. He built himself a house. At the very same moment, or just like a year earlier, or 2 years earlier, both Marcel Breuer and Walter Gropius, the faculty at Harvard, had built their houses.
Yeah. In Lincoln.
And their houses were in Lincoln, because they couldn't afford property, off Brattle Street. Right? And here is Johnson, the student, who comes in and builds this house right around the corner. And the joke of it was that it was, Gropius was very obsessed with, building using packaged materials and doing prefab, because the post-war, they were going to have to build for the masses, and it was going to be an explosion of housing, and there was a crisis, and the war was on. So Johnson builds this house for himself, and it's a prefab. That's the only time he ever did anything prefab. And there's all these stories at the time, because he had learned at MoMA how to handle the press. So he was always talking about how, this is a house that you can mass produce, and he was not interested in mass producing this thing at all. It was completely a house for himself and himself alone.
Yeah, and dinner parties which excluded the students.
Right. Well, sometimes he'd have them over. There was a great story about one of the he had students over to the house that had like this big glass wall, as he had a penchant for, and a drunk student banged into the wall and broke this glass planar wall, and he was so mad. He was not invited
But so
back.
he finishes after 7 years and starts his own architectural practice, and obviously Mrs. de Menil played an important role in getting him to be acceptable as an architect. That Texas was important by 1950.
Right. He starts building after the war, after he graduates. He starts building these modern houses for this new clientele of wealthy Americans who are moving to the suburb. It's the post-war period. People are moving to the suburbs, and there's a new class of young, wealthy individuals with progressive ideas who are moving to the suburbs, and Johnson is going to build for them. And he builds a series of beautiful, I think it's really much of his finest work is this sort of modernist Miesian designs he
The
builds.
Wiley House.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Including his own, the Glass House, right, the most famous of them. And he builds for the Menils in Houston, who he gets to know through the Museum of Modern Art. And the Menils are incredible for him, because Jean and Dominique de Menil, they are immigrants to America from Paris, from France. Jean is actually a baron, and Dominique is the heir to the Schlumberger Oil Services fortune, and Jean is going to come over to Houston and take over the company in America. And they are incredibly cosmopolitan, and they're centers of society. And so they hire Johnson, whom they meet through MoMA, to design a house for them. And then it's through them that he gets like a series of commissions. They provide him this entree, and you can sort of trace almost everything he does in Texas in sort of this game of like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. But it all goes back to the Menils.
Yeah. Then there's this sort of auteur phase, and then he decides to be completely ambitious and forms a partnership with John Berge. And the two of them build this huge number of skyscrapers all over the country, most of which you don't like, but a few of which you do. And I wonder if you could talk about that phase of his career and your sort of critical view of it. We have 2 buildings in Dallas from that phase, right? Comerica and
the Crescent.
Yeah.
The Crescent.
I have a different view, so we'll argue about this later.
Oh, man. All right.
Let me interrupt for 1 second. When you go up the escalators outside of the department store, whatever it's called, Korshak, and you turn around and look at the whole building from the top of the escalators looking towards the big building, that is to architecture what John Philip Sousa is to music.
And I just like to, here's my tuba player going. What I think is interesting to know about Johnson is that his skyscraper phase did not come until quite late in his career.
Right.
Right. Remember, so that Johnson has like these 3 careers. He starts out as a curator, he becomes a fascist, and then only then does he become an architect. And most of his career as an architect, he is not building skyscrapers.
Right.
Right.
Not till
he's
the
building
80s.
He's building residential buildings and then institutional buildings,
Museums,
museums,
libraries, concert
this kind
hall.
of thing.
Yeah.
Because the truth is, he can't get commercial work. He wants to do commercial work, except Johnson is not acceptable to commercial clients.
Yeah.
Because he is so controversial, and not just because of his fascist history, not just because he was essentially publicly gay, but also because he was willing to just be controversial. He in the 60s, in some ways was quite radical. He often inveiled against the car and corporations and what corporations were doing to the American city. And he was he was a member of the establishment, but he was also this troublemaker. So if you were a corporation, I'm not sure he's the person you want to hire.
So he needs somebody else, and
he needs somebody to sort of lend, to show to this sort of corporate boards that this is a person you can trust and is going to get something done. And in the late 60s, he hooks up with a man named John Berge, who came out of the office of in Chicago of
Perkins and Will?
no of what a big corporate firm in Chicago. It sort of hit the glass ceiling. It worked on O'Hare Airport, so he was definitely a
Not Skidmore, Owings and Merrill.
No.
Yeah.
He was someone who could get things done, get things doneer. He was a handsome, an architect in a blue suit who your corporate executive could speak the language of the corporate executive, and teamed with Berge, all of a sudden they can start building skyscrapers.
Yeah.
The first one they do together
It was IDS.
is IDS in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful building. And with it, so it's this faceted tower and blue glass, Miesian, but sort of at the base it has this giant crystal court. If you watch the opening credits to Mary Tyler Moore, you can see her in the crystal court. So you can make it after all. It's a wonderful building. And then after that, Pennzoil Place in Houston, which is to me
even more wonderful.
It's the apogee.
Yeah.
It's really the apogee of corporate architecture. And but this starts, he's already about 70 years old. It's only because he lives to be 98 that we have this late career where there start to be a huge number of towers. So those first 2 towers, Pennzoil and IDS, they're modernist buildings, beautiful. But soon enough, he's bored with this modern. He's always looking to shake things up, to create controversy, to find the new, and this is when AT&T happens, right? So we get the Chippendale topped,
Right. Which was it was a kind of publicity stunt to end all publicity stunts. It was on the front page of the New York Times. It was everywhere.
The most controversial building of the era.
Yeah.
It put him on the cover of Time magazine 5 years before it opened, right? Holding it,
With
a
the
model
model.
of it like it was the 10 Commandments, right? And it was hated, it was loved, but it was made him the center of the universe. And this begets a series of increasingly awful corporate towers around America. And it's the 80s, it's the Reagan era, it's morning in America. America's becoming from the 70s, we've moved into a much more conservative time, a more wealthy time. And the country is building these towers that reflect that conservatism and that worldview with the safety of these architectural elements that are familiar. And Johnson is willing to abet that, to produce the kind of architecture that is going to make that clientele feel comfortable, that is the skyscraper analog to the McMansion with that the corporate executive goes home to in the evening. He's building these towers all across America, Comerica here, Momentum Place, as it was originally called.
Denver, everywhere.
Denver, New York, Atlanta,
Boston.
Detroit, Louisville, Philadelphia. There is not, literally every major city, practically every major city. No, there's one in Chicago. LaSalle.
LaSalle Place, that's right.
LaSalle, and some of them have gables. Houston, of course, some of them have gables, and some of them have barrel vaults, and some of them have Palladian windows. Boston, of course. And this is the moment when he is accused by his peers of, he is, does this building in Boston. It's truly awful. And his peers, at a conference with his peers, they take him to task, and his response is, in case you haven't noticed, I don't have any principles, I am a whore. And
he actually said it.
That's not me. Don't look at me. When you're a biographer of Johnson, you keep getting stuck with his it's like, I'm not the fascist, I've accused of dwelling on his fascism, and I just keep telling people I'm not the one who dwelled on it.
I remember the last time he came to Dallas, and it was for the dinner to open the Rachofsky House, and he kept referring to Stanley Marcus as Junior. It did not go well.
Well, but I mean, this is an important part of Johnson's history, which is Richard Meyer was among a whole group of architects who Johnson, through his power, through the museum, through the spotlight he had, through his ability to confer commissions, was able to support and promote. From Richard Meyer, Charles Gwathmey, Peter Eisenman, Rem Koolhaas, Zaha Hadid, David Child, Bob Stern, like this whole group of architects at Norman Foster, this sort of group of architects.
He was like the grandfather.
He called them his kids. And he basically invented this class of starchitects, these jet-setting architects who traveled the world building their fancy, expensive baubles around the world. And so, I mean, we're in the Arts District here. The Arts District could not exist without Phillip Johnson, even though there is not a Phillip Johnson building in the Arts District. And it's not to condemn all of these buildings, because I think there's some really wonderful buildings.
But the idea that they're by these major figures.
And people he'd supported, Renzo Piano at the Masher.
Pre-Pritzker Prize.
Yes, and Renzo Piano, for example, gets his break with the Musée Pompidou.
And Pompidou,
with the Pompidou, and Johnson is really the chief on the jury for the Pompidou, and he's the one who really pushes for the Piano Rogers Award. So,
who were Johnson's peers, in your view? Who were the people who I.M. Pei?
Pei is a good example of his peer. They were frenemies.
Because
they were very much
Pei
the
is
same
in none
age.
of those photographs, and he doesn't go to the 95th birthday. And
No, they were in architecture school together. They were friends, and they lived these parallel careers. and they just sort of like two sharks circling each other. But
Kevin Roche.
Similar. Roche, I think, stayed away. Roche is very much came out of the Saarinen office, and I think Saarinen was a little bit more revered than Johnson, and Roche kind of followed him, was much more quiet. Ed Larrabee Barnes. We're in a building by Ed Larrabee Barnes. Barnes was also connected to MoMA. Barnes and Johnson hated each other. One of Johnson's great put-downs was about Ed Larrabee Barnes, who designed this building. He called him a sheep in sheep's clothing.
Yeah.
I don't think it's particularly fair. He was mean, right? I mean, but that's one of the reasons why people both loved and loathed Johnson, right? I mean, if you were on the sting end of that kind of a comment, it could hurt. On the other hand, if you weren't, it was super fun. I mean, who else is going out talking about their peers like that? So he was just such a fun, cantankerous figure. He's really fun to write about.
Well, the book ends with this kind of remembrance of Phillip Johnson while he was still alive, given at his 95th birthday, I guess, by Frank Gehry.
Right, yes.
And it's interesting to write a book which is filled full of Mark's words with lots of quotations, but to end it with Frank Gehry's words. Why did you do that?
Well, first of all, you got to read the epilogue, which is all my words.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
So that's where I sort of tie the whole thing together. Yeah. But the end of it, Johnson had developed this very, very special relationship with Gehry. Yeah. And I think it's really, really an interesting relationship. Johnson had all these kids, but in many ways those relationships were transactional. Through his connection to them, he needed that to stay alive, right?
Yeah.
That energy.
And they needed it to get more famous.
They were all using it to drive each other's fame.
Yeah.
And the Gehry relationship was a little different. They really had this deep affection for each other. And whereas some of the others were using him, and enjoyed the intellectual sparring with him, Gehry really took personally cared about him, and is an incredibly articulate person.
Yeah.
The story about when the first time Gehry meets Johnson is really fun. So it's in the early 70s, and Gehry is this sort of hot young star in California, but no one on the East Coast had heard of him. He has basically very low profile in the architecture field, and he designed a house and studio for the painter Ron Davis, wonderful modern painter. And
we have a Ron Davis in the DMA.
There you go. And Johnson, phones to say he wants to come visit the Davis house. So both Gehry and Davis are super excited about this. Gehry because Johnson is coming to look at his house, and Davis because Johnson is one of the great, modern art collectors of that period. So this is huge for both of them, that this eminence from MoMA is coming to, look at both of their work. But if you're sort of in the early 70s and you're a little nervous about some guy visiting you at your house in California in that time, what do? Well, to relax, you smoke a little weed. And then you smoke a little more weed. And then you smoke a lot of weed. And finally, Johnson shows up, looks around, and leaves. And neither Gehry or Davis can remember him arriving and leaving.
So we have 7 or 8, or I've forgotten how many buildings by Johnson in Dallas. And Fort Worth, which one do you admire, or which ones do you admire? We know what you think of the Crescent.
Yes. I'm a big fan of the Amon Carter Museum because I think it's it's that kind of architecture is often dismissed. Today we call that sort of modern classicist new formalism. I think it's quite beautifully made and an elegant building. But what I really love is what it does for the collection there. It's all these, this Remington and the Charles Russell.
Yeah.
And these works are typically seen in these historicist, kitschy, Western-themed rooms. And I love seeing them in Johnson's modern rooms. It gives these paintings a kind of dignity and seriousness that I think they deserve and that they sort of don't have when they're all next to a bunch of like credenzas and other stuff. So I really love that, and it's a beautiful building. And I also am I love the interfaith peace chapel, sort of buried in the sort of detritus of car dealerships on the way out to Love Field.
Yeah.
And it's this charming, really beautifully made, thanks largely to Corky Cunningham. I don't know if Corky's here tonight, but this beautifully made little delicate building. If like Casper the Ghost were a building, it would be that building. It's light and airy, and it's designed for this, LGBT congregation that had lost so many during AIDS crisis, and I just think it's a really sweet building.
I was with Corky at the Glass House when that building was being worked on in the cathedral, which was never built, and I have this very powerful memory. We were discussing seating in churches, and Johnson hated pews, and he liked chairs, and so and he wanted to show Mike Piazza what it looked like to have chairs. But his library, as you know, is a separate building, and he could no longer walk. And so Corky put him on his back with Johnson's knees through his elbows, and we all walked down the hill to the library and sat down, and he pulled off books, or we pulled off books from the shelves. And it made me really so aware of his knowledge of architectural history and the way that he could use architectural precedent in a way that it was not just quoting, that had a kind of deeper significance. And I remember that trip because I'd never been in the library. And the library is, I think, one of the most beautiful of the buildings on the property.
I love that building. It's sort of Aldo Rossi kind of. It's like a little dream. Lovely building.
And a place for one person to read. I mean, imagine having the ability to construct in your own, not a folly where you go and have tea or whatever, but a place with serious books where you can sit and read and look at the one window that has the right view and the right light with the right amount of natural light from above. It was just magical that day. I think even Corky thought it was magical.
I think it's a great metaphor for me, this idea of carrying Johnson on your back. It feels like that's what I've been doing for 9 years, and it's nice to finally have him off there. And
well, thanks, Mark, a lot. We want to hear from all of you. So.
John Mullen. As soon as the book came out, I thought, okay, Amazon, here I come, boom, 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 boom. I tend to read technical books, and my wife tends to read, and not tends, but only reads fiction. And now, having read the book, I realized that if it had been fiction and someone had come up with this life of this man, you'd put it down after a couple of chapters because you'd say there's no way in hell that could be. It is a truly extraordinary life that this man had, and the extent of your research and putting it together, it's as if you were at his elbow through the entire 90-some-odd years, is truly impressive. I
did not pay him to do this. I did not. I swear to you, I did not.
Well, that'll come, Mark. But I can only say that in my opinion, as an architect, and having met Phillip Johnson 55 years ago at the Seagram's Building, and over a drafting table at Yale Architecture School, This book is an absolute must-read for anyone with an architectural interest, but even with no architectural interest, this man's life is extraordinary. Little did I know, and I thought I knew. It is a must-read. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, John. Wow. Again, that was unsolicited.
I'm a huge fan of both of yours, and I read your column religiously and faithfully in the Dallas Morning News. Having said that, I went to the Glass House last summer, and when I got off of the tour van, my knees buckled because the visitor center there is just a miniature version of the Interfaith Peace Chapel. And I was totally taken back by that. And apparently that was the last building he built on that property before he passed. My question was, there's been an issue with acoustics, and apparently there were issues with acoustics in both the visitor center and in the Peace Chapel here in Dallas. Can you speak to that at all?
Well, yeah, I think the building you're referring to is what was called Da Monsta, which is
You
really
should use your baseball voice.
the building is known as Da Monsta. No, betting third. Yeah, so that project is called the Da Monsta, and it's this sort of free. I wouldn't say it's exactly like the Interfaith Peace Chapel, although they're very much from the same idiom. This is when Johnson sort of glommed onto Gehry and also Frank Stella, who were practicing this sort of free-form architecture. And I don't think it's a very good building at all. Herbert Mouchamp was the New York Times critic and Johnson acolyte, extolled this, I think, very derivative and functionally not very appropriate work as some kind of masterpiece, and it was kind of absurd at the moment. I think Mouchamp's doing that was really made people wonder about him. They already did. But the building was put there as theoretically it was going to be the sort of entry pavilion for the Glass House when it became a museum or what. But the truth was Johnson didn't really give a crap about that. He was interested in experimenting with forms. So functionally, it just is completely useless. You can't speak in it. You can't have someone speaking in it and other people listening because you can't hear a word. It's never had been of any use in any way, and it's basically just this completely derivative rich man's folly that was extolled as a work of genius because Johnson had friends in the media. I'm not a fan of it at all.
And I remember once actually somebody asking Mr. Johnson about the acoustics in the Cathedral of Hope. What would happen to the sound in this building that was completely dark and was very tall, and his response was, "I'm an architect, not an acoustician."
Here we have a question. Would you just stand up for us?
Johnson's never was super concerned with functional, right? This is a man who lived in a glass house, right? So function wasn't always the object.
I'm Alice Reagan Stevenson, and Phillip Johnson, as the first recipient of that Pritzker Prize in 1979, from what you say, doesn't sound like he had many peers. So who would have been in the realm of his existence to bestow that incredible award to him?
That's actually a great question. So the Pritzker is now, it's revered as the Nobel Prize of Architecture, and he helped make it so. But so why was he given that award? Johnson at that point was the most powerful figure in American architecture. both loved and reviled. But as for exactly who was it? So the jury, if memory serves, consisted of his college roommate, Carlton Fisk. So it was like all, so his college roommate was on the jury, Caesar Pelli was on the jury, and he had just been awarded Caesar Pelli's biggest commission, the MoMA job. So he was on the jury that had given Caesar Pelli an award, and now Pelli sort of is there to give it back to him. Also, Ada Louise Huxtable, who I think was on that jury. She had worked for him. Basically, the jury was all a series of Johnson's peers and friends. So the Pritzker has never really been well, we could have a long discussion about the Pritzker Prize here. You can read some of my columns about it. It's, yeah.
Yeah, enough said.
But let's just say it's not exactly like without its internal politics.
Well, in a way, the awarding of the first Pritzker Prize to Phillip Johnson was the recognition of his stature in American architecture, and it, as you said, it made the prize even more.
Oh, of course. Oh, and by the way, this is all in the book.
It is all in the book, yeah.
Yes. Don't think it's not there.
Mark, Kyle Ogden, say a few words about Thanksgiving Square, and since we're talking about non-functioning pieces of art.
Pleasure of living across the street from Thanksgiving Square for 3 years when we were living in the Republic Bank building, and I kind of loved it. It's such a weird building, right? I mean, or is it a building? Is it a square? Is it a park? Is it a church? It's one of these weird Johnson projects that is kind of, I mean, just to think that in Dallas, Texas, of all places, to build an interfaith peace chapel based on a mosque in Iraq. It's so unlikely, it's hilarious.
Well, there are people who dislike it for exactly that reason, because the form is Muslim.
It is puzzling, but it's also kind of fun, and
I love it.
I mean, the problem with the park, I think, is, it's hermetic. It's never really been had the usage that it should, but I've never really been sure whether the problem is Johnson or Dallas, right? I mean, like, this is a city that we treat pedestrians as like a civic nuisance, and only recently only within the last couple of years have the buildings surrounding the square filled in. And now that they have the sort of chapel part of it is down on its. Wouldn't it be great to have wonderful, wonderful Cafe Momentum doing some cafe service down there, really bring some life into it?
In the center of it, yeah.
I know there are plans to like sort of bring down the barriers and the concrete and open it up to the city a little more, and I'm hopeful about the future for Thanksgiving Square. It's a unique, interesting place, and it's not perfect, but it's, I think, weird. A city needs weird stuff, so I'm always for more weird is good.
So, sorry to go back to the Crescent, but I have a question. I think I read, maybe it was in David Dillon's book, that Johnson said about the Crescent, they wanted artsy-fartsy, so I gave them artsy-fartsy. Is that true? I'm interested in what was the inspiration, if you want to even use that word, about the Crescent, and does it have anything to do with Dallas having typically been more of a conservative in taste for architecture prior to particularly the Arts District?
This is your deal.
Okay, well, Johnson would say anything to anybody that he thought was appealing at the moment. So Dallas wanted artsy-fartsy is the kind of thing he would just say. He would say a million different things depending on who he was talking to. So I'm sure when he was talking to the client, he had very specific reasons for all of the design moves and references in that building, whether they're New Orleans French or the filigree of Galveston, but all blown up to like just massive, massive proportions, right? So to me, there's two issues with the Crescent. There's one is the style, right? The aesthetics treatment, which is one thing, but the other is like just this immense, immense scale and the way it works in the city, how unfriendly it is to the pedestrian. Just the other day I was driving on, was it Pearl and McKinney, and when you approach it, driving on Pearl, it's just so this just incredible gargantuan inhumane thing, and it's nowhere it doesn't make any kind of contact with the street. It's just the irony of Johnson, who spent much of the 60s inveigling against exactly this kind of architecture, and then to go and actually do it is really kind of amazing. But that was Johnson, you know. Johnson was completely opposed to a lot of things right up until the point when he got the opportunity to do them himself. Preservation being a great example, right? I mean, he was a absolute advocate for preservation, right? He helped save, he tried to help save Penn Station in New York. He then did help save Grand Central Terminal, helped save the Glessner House in Chicago. But when it came to his own projects, well, sure, he'd propose knocking down the Times Tower in Times Square if he'd get to build his phalanx of giant towers there. Sure, no problem. An urban renewal scheme that would have knocked down the entirety of Harlem? Sure, yeah. Why not? Knock down some beautiful Beaux-Arts townhouses right next to MoMA so MoMA can expand? Okay. So for him, it was very much, there was an opportunistic note to everything he did.
I remember asking him about that, and he had a little twinkle in his eye, and he said, well, remember, there were 6 flags over Texas, and one of them was France.
Well.
So it's Adrian. Hi, Mark. And
hi. It's my boss, so I'm going to be extremely nice here.
So the response to the last comment sort of brings me back to a point that's been sort of lingering in the back of my mind throughout this whole conversation, because you've had the first part sort of very much about, him as curator, then the sort of fascist period and political involvement, leaves that, picks up and goes into Harvard, and then goes on to become an architect. But I'm sort of interested in the continuity between these things, and in particular, the sort of the fascist piece in the middle there. And in what way do you think that trickled through into his sort of approach to design as an architect? The focus on order and symmetry, and you were just sort of talking about sort of leveling things and this other part to him as a designer. Do you see his sort of fascist past re-emerging in him as an architect in any way?
Yeah, you do. I think he was pretty well criticized for much of his work, especially in the 60s, in this new formalist period. Buildings like Amon Carter, for example, with this sort of monumental modern classicism that felt very fascist, and he was accused of it being fascist. Lincoln Center, the Crystal Cathedral in California, places where there is an emphasis on order and rigidity and this sort of aestheticization of design and architecture above all. He very much admired Albert Speer's Cathedral of Light, and I think you can see that in some of his work. So I think that you can read it architecturally, if you'd like to, in some of his work. And then there's,
But you could also think about Kevin Roach and think about, I mean, there are other architects who were not fascists who had similar.
Well, there were lots of architects practicing in that style, but I think many of them were accused of this being being a fascistic
aggrandizing
style,
it,
and for Johnson it hit especially close to home given his history. So that's the aesthetic style. Then there's the other question is his personality and how he operated. Did he ever really give up his thoughts, the way his thinking? I mean, he was friendly with Jews. He supported Jews. He built a synagogue. This is a man who built a nuclear research facility in Israel, right? So 15 years after he's supporting, Hitler, he turns around and he helps the Jewish state build a building that's going to help them develop the bomb. So completely fascinating duality. Yet within him, I think there's always a part of him that is attached to this history. I mean, it's deeply ingrained in him. This prejudice is his worldview he has this very Nietzschean worldview, and a worldview that comes from privilege. And he got past it, but I think it was also always within him. So I think there's two levels of looking at that.
John Mullen again. Thinking about Thanksgiving Square. Way back in the 60s, I officed a block from that site, and I happened to know Peter Stewart. And Peter and I talked about that site a bit, and I realized this was before he started it, when he was trying to decide whether or not to buy that triangular block. And it was obvious that he had a tremendous amount of thinking about what it could be and what it should be. And it occurs to me now what we see at Thanksgiving Square to a great extent is Peter Stewart's thinking of what all needs to go there for the Thanksgiving concept. And it comes to mind reading the book, thinking so much about Phillip Johnson and his clients, the clientele, and his social connections that come from his upbringing and his Harvard and his traveling abroad and his wealth. And I'm wondering if, having only seen the Thanksgiving Square from a client side, I'm wondering if you see that in many of his other buildings, that they are driven to a great degree or a significant degree or to some degree by the client's wishes, or whether as he rose it became more his own thinking and his own baggage and whatnot. I see very much in Thanksgiving Square now Peter Stewart.
That's a wonderful question. I mean, I think always the best projects come from when an architect and or a client are aligned in their vision. And he usually had a pretty strong will on what he wanted to do, and found clients came to him because of who he was and were generally willing to follow his lead. But a strong client makes the best building. I think there are great stories about working with Gerald Hines and Hugh Lidke on Pennzoil Place, on what that form would look like and how they ended up with those asymmetrical angled tops, because Gerald Hines and Lidke wanted the building to be, they wanted the building to be distinctive. They weren't going to try and build the tallest tower in Houston, because they figured if they tried to build the tallest tower, someone else would just 10 minutes later build a taller tower, and then they'd lose their cachet. So they wanted to do something that was distinctive. And so it was sort of the push that came from the client, and sitting in conference rooms about what it would look like, and that's where the sort of the shape came from. That's how that design developed. And I think there are a lot of cases like that. But Johnson often was left to his own devices and wasn't sure how to proceed at all. He was often, people came to him because they thought he was Phillip Johnson, right? He would know what to do, and often he didn't know what to do. I think there's this really interesting point in his career where he's trying to figure out what a building should look like, and he's just so unsure that he starts throwing his buildings underground. So there's like this whole series of buildings for a short period that all there is like a berm with the door, because he literally had no idea what to do for a facade, and his solution was to just throw a grass blanket over the damn thing until he figured it out.
Treasury of Atreus is not true.
It's the treasure. Well, it is, but there's the Treasury of Atreus. There's Hendrix College. There's the Gehry. There's like a series of these buildings littered around America where Johnson just put grass over the darn thing. And the irony is that this became a very trendy thing to do around 2000, when all of a sudden everybody realizes they better start, or in the 90s, where people started building green. Everybody wants everything to be green. So, okay, we'll put green, we'll put the building under green. Johnson could not have cared less about being green. He had no interest in do-gooding at all. He thought it was boring. He liked architecture for, capital A architecture, but when he couldn't figure out what to do, he sort of had fallen back into this by accident.